Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why sometimes you just can't quite put your finger on what feels wrong with a movement or an action, even when you are trying to adapt? Well, this new study dives into exactly that, exploring how your brain adapts to weird situations and whether your own body can even tell you when something's off. This research is all about how we learn and adjust when things change unexpectedly. Imagine you are walking and suddenly one treadmill belt starts moving faster than the other. Your brain has to figure out how to fix that, right? This study asks a super interesting question. Does adapting to these tricky situations actually make it harder to notice the trick itself? And can we see this happening not just in our movements, but also in something as subtle as our pupils? So the scientists wanted to know if learning to deal with a problem, like a mismatch in your senses or movements, makes it harder to detect that problem in the first place. They also wanted to see if measuring pupil dilation could be a secret way to know if someone noticed a weird feeling without them even having to say anything. They tested this in 2 everyday actions, walking and grasping. To do this, they used 2 different ways to mess with people. One was like a ramp, where the change happened slowly, giving your brain plenty of time to adjust. The other was more unpredictable, like a De Bruijn sequence, where the changes were more random, creating a bigger surprise signal each time. They thought that the slow, ramp-like changes would make people adapt better. But also worse at noticing the disturbance itself, because the error signal wasn't as shocking. First up, they looked at walking. Participants walked on a special treadmill where they could control the speed of each belt independently. Imagine one belt going faster than the other. This creates a mismatch, and the researchers wanted to see if people noticed this mismatch and how their bodies reacted. Inside this setup, people wore eye-tracking glasses to measure their pupil size. They also had to answer questions about which belt was going faster. They used a method called a quest procedure to find out just how much of a speed difference people could notice, what we call their just noticeable difference, or JND. Scroll participants, we aimed for a sample size of 48 to achieve a power of 0.9 with an estimated effect size of Cohen's d 0.5, Cohen 1988. Scroll, they had 48 people in this part of the study, all checked to make sure they were healthy and could see and move normally. Everyone was kept in the dark about the exact study goals to make sure their responses were natural. Scroll procedure, each experiment started with the experimenter calibrating the motion tracking model, using an approx. 10-second long recording of the participant going from a T-pose to a slow walking motion. Scroll, after getting set up and calibrated, participants walked on the treadmill. The special part was how the speed changes were introduced. Some changes were gradual, like a ramp, while others were more unpredictable, using that De Bruijn sequence we talked about. After each change, participants were asked if they noticed one belt running faster. Scroll data analysis data from all sources were synchronized with the help of custom triggers and custom scripts written in R and run using R version 4.3.3, R Core Team 2024. Scroll, they collected a lot of data, how people walked, what their pupils did, and what they said. They used fancy computer programs to make sure all this data lined up perfectly. They looked at things like step length and how hard people pushed off the ground to see how their bodies adapted. For the eyes, they measured the pupil size before and after the changes. Scroll experiment, one average measured JNDs were 7.3%, a standard deviation of 4.1%. Scroll now. What did they find in the walking experiment? Well, they discovered that people were actually a bit worse at noticing the speed differences when the changes were introduced slowly, like on the ramp. Their just noticeable difference was larger in those ramp conditions compared to the more unpredictable De Bruijn sequence. This means it took a bigger speed difference for them to say, hey, something's different, when the change was gradual. Their bodies also showed signs of adapting. When the perturbation happened, their steps and ground forces changed. It was like their bodies were trying to compensate for the unevenness that was happening. Scroll pupil responses, pupil dilation data showed a difference between trials and ramp locks via De Bruijn. Sequence blocks with respect to the tonic pupil response FROL. And what about the pupils? The researchers found that pupil dilation, which is like the pupil getting bigger, did change. The tonic pupil response, which is a slower, more sustained change, was a bit different depending on the type of perturbation. It seemed to reflect uncertainty, which makes sense because the unpredictable changes likely cause more uncertainty. However, the phasic pupil response, a quicker reaction, wasn't as clear and didn't show big differences based on whether people noticed the perturbation. Scroll experiment 1 discussion in summary. Results from experiment 1 showed reduced detection performance for ramp. type perturbations, but not very strongly. Scroll so. In walking, the main takeaway was that gradual changes made it a little harder to detect the speed difference, and the pupil measurements hinted at this by showing some differences related to uncertainty. But the pupil response wasn't a perfect predictor of whether someone noticed. Next, they moved on to grasping. This experiment used a clever setup with mirrors. People would see an object in front of them through a mirror, but actually reach out and grasp a different physically present object behind the mirror. This allowed them to create a mismatch between what the person saw and what they felt. They could make the perceived object size different from the actual object size. Again, they used those ramp-like slow changes and the unpredictable De Bruijn sequences. And of course, they tracked pupil dilation. Scroll participants, we again aimed for a sample size of 48 to allow for a power of 0.9 with an estimated effect size of Cohen's d0.5, a realistic estimate as a previous study Pupil et al. 2025 had found an effect of Cohen's d0.69 for the main comparison of Ock differences between blocks where the perturbation was continuously changing Vs. When it was quickly adapted to scroll, this experiment also had 48 people, and again they were carefully chosen and unaware of the hypothesis. Scroll procedure then, the main experiment began, which consisted of 3 blocks each with maximal perturbations of 3 mm, 6 mm, or 12 mm, chosen to range from barely noticeable to clearly noticeable following result from Hillis et al. 2002 and Müller et al. 2025, in which perturbations followed either a ramp or a De Bruijn sequence. Scroll the procedure was similar to the walking experiment, but focused on grasping. Participants would reach and grab objects, and the goal was to judge if the grasped object felt smaller or larger than the one they saw. They collected data on grip movements and their pupil responses. Scroll data analysis psychophysics, one participant had to be retroactively excluded from psychophysical analyses since their larger Schissmaller responses did not scale with the physical differences, leaving us with a sample of N47 for psychophysical analyses. Scroll, just like with walking, they found that when the size mismatch was introduced gradually, ramp, people were worse at detecting it. The difference in how well they could tell the difference between sizes, measured by their JNDs, was larger in the ramp condition compared to the unpredictable De Bruijn sequence. It was a similar story to the walking experiment. The pupils again showed some interesting patterns. The tonic pupil response, that slower change, was sensitive to the size of the objects and the type of perturbation, again suggesting it reflects uncertainty. Interestingly, the phasic response, the faster pupil change, actually got bigger with more uncertainty or surprise in this grasping task, which was the opposite of what they saw in the walking task. This difference between the two tasks is something they discuss later. Scroll Experiment 2 discussion in summary, results from Experiment 2 showed, just like Experiment 1, that when participants were able to adapt almost fully to a perturbation, i.e. in a ramp-type perturbation schedule, their detection performance was worse than under conditions that did not enable almost full adaptation, i.e. in a De Bruijn sequence schedule, but this was again not a large effect. Scroll, so grasping also showed that gradual changes made it harder to notice the size difference, and pupil dilation provided clues about uncertainty, though with some differences in how the quick pupil responses behaved compared to walking. Scroll general discussion in both experiments, participants performed more poorly on the perturbation. Detection task when the perturbation was introduced gradually following a ramp-type schedule rather than an unpredictable De Bruijn sequence. Thus, we replicate earlier findings from our group in grasping Müller et al. 2025, Pupil et al. 2025 that showed that participants use both perturbation magnitude and the motor error for perturbation detection, and extend them by finding the same pattern in walking and using perturbation schedules that more directly isolated the effect of a reduced error signal through adaptation scroll. Now, let's tie it all together. The biggest finding here is that adapting to something, whether it is a change in walking speed or a visual haptic size mismatch, makes it harder to detect that change. This holds true for both walking and grasping, suggesting it is a general principle. When you are busy adjusting your movements, your brain might be less likely to flag the very thing you are adjusting to. The researchers were really interested in using pupil dilation as a no-report marker, a way to gauge if someone notices something without them having to actively tell you. They found that pupil dilation did respond to the perturbations, especially the tonic response, and seemed to reflect uncertainty. However, it wasn't reliable enough to tell on a trial. By trial basis, if someone definitively detected the perturbation, While pupil responses showed average differences, they were too inconsistent from one moment to the next to be a guaranteed signal. Scroll similar data patterns in two very different motor actions by choosing walking and grasping as our model actions. We used two inherently multimodal actions. Scroll, a really cool aspect of this study is that they used two very different actions, walking and grasping, and found similar patterns. This suggests that the way our brains handle adaptation and detection might be quite general and not specific to just one type of movement. Both actions involve complex sensory feedback, and still, the same core principles seem to apply. Scroll imitations and outlook our study improved on our previous works by making the results more generalizable, both by replicating them in a different motor action, but also by using perturbation schedules that were chosen specifically to isolate perturbation magnitude and the error signal. Scroll now. What are the limitations? The researchers themselves point out that the effect of adaptation making detection harder wasn't a huge, dramatic difference. It was more subtle. This could mean that the sheer size of the change, the perturbation magnitude, also plays a really strong role, independent of how much you've adapted. Also, as mentioned, the pupil data wasn't a perfect lie detector for noticing. The high amount of missing data in the eye tracking, especially in the grasping task, also limits how much we can conclude from it. Scroll conclusion, we show that adapting to a perturbation impairs the actor's ability to detect the perturbation. In walking and grasping similarly, we also demonstrate concurrent tonic pupil dilation responses that are consistent with an effect of uncertainty. Scroll, so what is the big picture? This study beautifully shows that our brains are constantly adapting using error signals to fine-tune our actions. But this very process of adaptation can sometimes blind us to the changes we're making. It highlights the complex interplay between perception and action, and how our body's subtle signals, like pupil dilation, can hint at our internal states, even if they're not perfect predictors yet. The fact that these patterns are seen in both walking and grasping is a strong indicator that these are fundamental mechanisms of how we learn and interact with the changing world. It makes you wonder how often this happens in everyday life. We're so busy adjusting to the little things, we might not even notice them. Scroll acknowledgements, we thank Alina Schenk, Sebastian Meisner, Adrian Kalms, Jonas Brockner, and Daniel Merkel for their help with collecting data. Scroll, this is really insightful research, pushing the boundaries of how we understand learning and perception. It is a great reminder that our brains are incredibly dynamic systems, always trying to make sense of the world, even when it is throwing us curveballs. If you found this breakdown helpful, give this video a big thumbs up, leave a comment below with your thoughts on adaptation and perception, and don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more dives into the fascinating world of psychology. See you next time!